I just like to touch some historical background to show where I think America has missed the boat in terms of its diplomacy and policy towards the Horn of Africa. And I'm one of those people who lived through time to witness America's often mistaken policies. I came to a refugee displaced from Ethiopia, Jigjiga, in 1981. And arriving in Los Angeles, my world of that yesteryear somehow seems to be similar to the current situation after 40 plus years. I started a small clerk job at a 7-Eleven when I came. And one day while I was clerking, the owner called me and said, a big man is out there waiting for you to talk. I found out that he was a US congressional member. I cannot recall his name, but he sat with me for a good 30 minutes and deliberated with me as to my experience and how I see things and what had happened in the area that I came from, and gave me a level of comfort and encouragement. And with that encouragement, I pursued my education, joined the UCLA, and since then became active in the Horn of Africa politics. One day at UCLA, the late James S. Coleman, one of the founding fathers of the African Studies Association, and indeed the founder of the African Studies Center at UCLA, invited me to his 11th floor at the Bench Hall for a coffee. While I was there with him conversing on general issues about Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, he received a very important call and he said, Faisal, let me pick up this phone call. Believe it or not, the phone call was from Poland. It was from Lech Walesa, who was the leader of the Solidarity movement. Then and at that time, as a young man, I learned that institutions and research centers in America have a weight that most of us don't see. They sway public policy in the United States and diplomacy. They also closely work with the State Department and the policy formulation leaders. And since then, I give credit and credence to those of you who really want to listen to us. 40 years ago at UCLA again, the African Studies Department hosted a very important conference called Crisis on the Horn, 40 years ago. And it really showed Farrell, who wrote the Clouds of War on the Horn, but the conference depicted two Ethiopians at the time, Berekat Haile Selassie, and who was a known quantity in terms of the theoretization of the Horn of Africa and diplomacy, and Nuguse Ayele, who was at the time spokesperson for the DER, and also himself a UCLA graduate. The two people really debated on issues that today those of us who are sitting here probably would be debating. What is the role of the US? Why the US sides with a government that is at war with its own people, and the other side saying the US should maintain its diplomatic relationship with Ethiopia because Ethiopia, for good or bad, it's an anchor to the US policy. In general, Ethiopia is really a complex country. It's a complex not only to outsiders, but also a complex to those of us who grew up and have a lived experience. On the one hand, it's a country that attracts and mesmerizes the memories and imaginations of the West, because to them, it's the only African country that's close to the West's version of civilization. To some Ethiopians, Ethiopia is the only imperial force in the continent. And to those of us in the east of Ethiopia, such as the Ogaden region, it's a recent colonial power. As you know, that the Somali region in Ethiopia was incorporated to Ethiopia in 1954. My father had a marriage certificate with my mom that was signed by a British consulate that was in Jiga at the time. It's that recent, and those issues, the imperiality of Ethiopia, the civilization that mesmerizes some of the Westerners, which look a single story of Ethiopian exceptionalism, and those of us who see the recent incorporation of Ethiopia, all of us do have a different version of what Ethiopia is. But what and who are the people and the countries of the Horn of Africa? That is probably of interest to this panel. The Horn of Africa region, as we know, comprises Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Kenya. This is a troubled region from historical point of view. It has and it still remains the scars of the scramble for Africa and the vestiges of the Second World War and the 21st century's renewed revival of the Cold War. I'm mentioning the Second World War because two major things happened besides the history that we often repeat about Ethiopia. One, it came close to a creation of an Oromo state at the end of the Second World War. There was the Oromo Republic that was organized by the Italian, and if that had continued and succeeded, Oromia today would have been a different country. That's number one. And number two, the Somali incorporation into Ethiopia became literally part of the fabric of Ethiopia's politics, and we are here today for that too. The complexity of the Ethiopian situation is today to be fashioned, in my opinion, by something that both the West and the Ethiopian political elite ignore. While Ethiopia is the second most populous country, which we always repeat and say whenever we are writing something or speaking, there is an omission here that we conveniently do so. At the same time, Oromo is probably, if not the single largest ethnic or national group in the continent, it's the second. If you combine the Hausa Fulani and make that group as one grouping, then Oromo would become the second largest, 40 million people whose awakening just is as young as it could be. Whereas the Somali nationalism is somewhat a bit matured, and if you will, at it is old age, the Oromo nationalism is to be reckoned, and if political opinion makers and policy makers in the West don't hear the cries of the Oromo youth, as Fatuma put it, or Pakale Gabra's analysis of what has happened in the Ethiopian transition, then I think the US and the West would miss a huge opportunity in the coming few years. Now, in the last 30 years, the region of the Horn of Africa has seen collapsed states such as Somalia or semi-collapsed states in Ethiopian case, or in, for that matter, Eritrea. And if the Ethiopian state collapses or continues to stay on the track of being collapsed, and anybody can argue that it has more or less from socio-political point of view collapsed, then we are looking at the population that we often cite, Ethiopia being as the second largest and most populous country, which has a connotation of richness in terms of potential commercial. That huge population could be weaponized, and dislocation could take place and disrupt the entire Horn of Africa. Suppose 15% of the Ethiopian population gets displaced in the case that Ethiopia disintegrates or collapses. What you are looking at is an avalanche of people, particularly Oromo people, flooding Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, that could possibly have a long-term impact on the region. And the consequences of that could take the US and other Western countries a huge effort to contain and even help. Having said that, I think in the current geopolitical reality, the Horn of Africa remains an enigma at best and a challenge to the US policy, and it has been a challenge for a while. How does the US therefore remain relevant to both those that rule the region, meaning people who are in the power, as Bakale was talking about, at the same time help the democratic transition, which we all agree that at once in 2018, it started to be teetering at the seams. I think we need to recognize, in order to answer some of those questions, that the US cannot, and I would really underline that, cannot sustain its foreign policy only by prioritizing its military interests. In the era where the people of the region are getting more educated, more integrated, linked to the global world, having communities in the United States and lobbying, the militaristic approach to the Horn of Africa is a passé. It cannot sustain, nor will it serve the US interest from the greater picture. Historically, US foreign policy has failed, in my opinion, to win friends from the masses of the Horn of Africa. It always, most of the time, starting from Haile Selassie to a certain degree with the Derg, maintained good, if not, at times challenging relationship with the rulers, but it always came short in winning the hearts and minds of the people that it really wants to help. And as a US citizen who has thrived and loved this country, I don't doubt the intent of the US to help, but I think we probably are using the wrong methodologies and the wrong tools here. The US government and its policies towards Ethiopia never centered either the Oromo or the Cushitic groups that are probably close to 70% of the people. Now that at that 70%, the tortured and maligned and literally massacred Tigray population, you have the Ethiopian majority to the tune of 75 people looking and longing for a system that can serve all of us, and that is probably a more democratic federal system, despite all the propagandistic things that we hear, such as Ethiopia is being killed by ethnic federalism. And there is nothing, and you will hear that tomorrow probably, there is nothing of the word of ethnic in the Ethiopian constitution. There are nations and nationalities and composed that country. Therefore, a successful US engagement in Ethiopia must include politics of equity and social justice, where the majority's voices are heard, while the other voices are also accommodated. What we have been accustomed to in the last half a century, if you will, since 1945, when the Ethio-US policy cemented and sent its roots deep, the US government has been listening to one very vocal and powerful voice, and that excludes most of the people that make up the Ethiopian demography. The US government has been kind to Ethiopia, both politically as well as materially. In particular, the monetary cost that the US gives to the Ethiopian government then and now is one that really does not promote what makes America's #1 political commodity, and that is democratic ethos. America prides itself on being the mother and father of democratic systems. When it goes to Ethiopia, it inadvertently undermines its own ethos. For example, in 1977, when the Derg declared itself to be a hardcore Marxist-Leninist regime and signed a military pact with the then Soviet Union, America still stayed true to its often undeclared prioritization of militaristic interests and continued to aid the Derg both materially as well as politically. A regime that finally ended up killing thousands of its own citizens. The US, in essence, enabled the Derg to acquire hard currency and other financial processes to then be able to stay in power longer and purge more people and longer and go on on that course. Barakat Haile Selassie, who was at the time an Ethiopian but now a full-fledged Eritrean, wrote in 1980 this: With the advent of the massive Soviet arms infusion into Ethiopia beginning in 1977, US aid through AID and the World Bank shifted to the economic side to still continue with monetary rewards. Barakat argues that such support emboldened the Derg to strengthen its alliance with the Soviet Union diplomatically and still continue its domestic mayhem against its own people at the home front. The Derg's status to deal with both superpowers comfortably prompted Barakat to retort this. Is the US and the Soviet in cahoots with each other to keep Ethiopia the way it is? I think that was a bit of the cuffs, but Senator Henry Jackson, a Cold War liberal, and many others in the league at that time wondered whether Jimmy Carter and the US were suffering from what they call lack of will. I think, and I'm 100% sure today in some circles in Washington, that terminology, the lack of will by the United States to promote democracy in the Horn of Africa is in circulation. In their 2022 excellent piece, Who Lost Ethiopia, Harry Farnon and Michael Waldemariam also in a very diplomatic way make this point. They argue that the US policymakers continue a policy of appeasement of the current leader of Ethiopia, just like in the 1970s. The current administration enjoys, in my opinion, the cachet of the Soviet, Turkey, China, Iran, while it also gets very handsome cash from the United States of America directly or indirectly. The US administration seems to be comfortable with pumping money to a regime that it knows it's also very close to the Soviet Union. The ascendance of Dr. Abiy Ahmed to the premiership of Ethiopia in April 2018 ushered an unprecedented political change. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quickly transferred power from TPLF, EPRDF, from TPLF-dominated Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Front to its hitherto junior OPDO. The Economist wrote a very poignant piece in 2018 December and said Prime Minister Abiy has acted quickly, lifting a state of emergency, freeing thousands of people, political prisoners, and vowing to hold fair elections in 2020. He has signed a peace deal with Eritrea, whose the intent, in many opinions, was to bring Eritrea back to the world. That didn't work. I think it is always painful as a scholar and commentator to be an outlier. I think I was one of those people who was outliers at the time when everybody was praising Dr. Abiy and his reforms, simply because when I listened to his speeches, I didn't feel comfortable. But in 2018 July, I was traveling from Addis to Nairobi. Next to me was sitting a young Tigrenya doctor who clicked relation with me right away because she was a doctor one time in my hometown. This is July 2018, and Abiy was only a few months in power. She confided in me then that her people were leaving Addis Ababa in droves. Tigrenya middle class were feeling the negative vibe from Aret Kilo, and I wrote an article where I was highlighting what that young lady shared with me. But I also said there is the possibility that hate-based massacre could happen in Ethiopia. It happened that few days before I traveled to Ethiopia, I visited the West Los Angeles Holocaust Museum, where I watched a little movie clip that shows the conversation that was taking place in Hamburg and in the entire Germany towns, where the Jewish people could see the purge and the pogrom coming, and when they confide with their friends who were upper class Germans, what they sensed, their friends from good point of view were saying, no, this could not happen to you guys. By the time that happened to the Jews, it was too late to do anything. I think what we have seen in Ethiopia in 2020 and beyond, what happened in Tigray, what's happening in Oromia at this point in time was something that some of us who know started my speech, who believed that it could happen, were ignored by the international world and our diplomats in the US, in the US corps, particularly the US embassy in Addis Ababa, not only ignored, but supported that campaign that was coming to purge the Ethiopian masses. I don't want to take more time, but I would have liked to just quickly do some reflections on what's happening with the Al-Shabaab incursion into the region and what I believe to be as a solution. I think this is again Al-Shabaab, emboldened, sees how Ethiopia is weakened, and the fact that there is no security intelligence, that they have been transporting weapons and troops in the last 4 or 5 months, and now all of us believe that despite the incursion and the defeat of Al-Shabaab's contingent that came in the last few days, but they have already passed and established some bases in the mountains. A way out, number one, America should start listening to the noises, should not only listen to the loudest noises, it has to start listening to other voices, such as the Oromo Somali voice, and host and open its doors to the southern groups that are really being here wronged. Number two, I think we need a robust and timely diplomatic work to forge a common front consisting of Somali and Somali special forces and youth police to fight and pursue the Al-Shabaab. But I like one important issue that I like to just add to this, and that is the US State Department Africa Bureau needs to revisit its manual and see if they can update their manual towards the Horn of Africa and shift from the romantic approach to Ethiopia to the current reality of what Ethiopia is, what its demographics is. We consider the Oromia the belly of the hyena, if you will. And I think re-emphasizing how to tame and work with the belly and those who are around that belly could issue us some roadmap, but to come and update its manual, I don't think they have the Africa Bureau updated its manual. And lastly, for all the aid, this positive note to end, all the aid and billions of dollars that it continues to give in relief forms, and we cannot really underemphasize the positive contribution that the US does, although we see its diplomacy often wrong when it comes to the Horn of Africa. I think, US policymakers need to look at themselves very seriously. This is a huge failure. What happened in Tigray, what's happening now in Oromia, and the US embassy just actively engaging. What would they say tomorrow if they were assembled and asked to explain to us US citizens what their role was? They can't just say that Abiy did this and the US government was trying to convince him not to kill so many people. No, I don't think that will fly. I think an indication of our failure towards Ethiopia is measured by the magnitude of the problems and atrocities. And I think we have seen what had happened. What can the US do is really the question at this point in time. How can the US assist in completing the transition? There are some hopes that I like to serve as signs not to give up tomorrow or the coming few days. The TPLF Ethiopia talks will start in Nairobi. I think the US needs to put all its force behind that conference and those talking to work, and I'm sure they are doing that. But at the same time, to bring in other big giants such as the Oromo. This unilateral talks between two sides is not going to give Ethiopia any peace. I think they need to expand the table, include more people. I do understand that technically somebody saying that we have to do piece by piece and approach this slowly, but while we are closing one side of the avalanche and the pile, or another side that's opening up and creating a mess. So I think I would want the US government to pay more attention to that. And I have nothing to add, but I think the youth is, you're right. I think There is restlessness among the Oromo youth, but also other youth. Where I come from, there is no job creation activity going on for the youth. One of the reasons why Al-Shabaab incursion took place this time is for 6-7 months. Al-Shabaab has been working through networks to engage and handle and take some youth in the Afdar, Liban, that area, under Al-Shabaab wing. So, the problems are huge, but I think, our work is cut out for, and I don't have at this point in time, a quick solution. There's one Somali proverb that I just like to throw in, you can think. There's a proverb that says, if you try to cure a horse with a medicine intended for the donkey, that horse will always remain sick. So for the last 40 years, as I argued, we've been trying the same method. We need to change that, and we need to come up with new approaches to the Ethiopian situation. Would like to add one thing. I think in blunt language, the US policy has been failing in Ethiopia, and we can tell that from the results that we have today. Kenya Station used to be US attraction to Ethiopia. She lost that. Now Kenya Station is utilized by Russia. The current policy that we see and the current results that we see in the ground indicates that US policy has not really delivered the results that we all wished. Conflicts in Tigray and Oromia did not take place where the US did not stand by, or even where the US ambassador didn't accept the plea by Abiy to say, I finished this in 5 days. All those are symptoms and indications that we have failed. As to the division within the State Department, yes, I think it reminds me of the 1977 division between the two camps, Cyrus Vance and Andrew Yang on the one side, and Brzezinski on the other side. Brzezinski saying we need serious engagement wherever the Soviet comes in, whereas people like Andrew Yang and Cyrus Vance tried to appease the Derg. The same thing is happening today in the State Department, although I cannot tell personalities as to who is where, but definitely there are groups inside that say we have to die with Abiy no matter what, because he's the leader. And there are others who have seen the reality on the ground, as everybody said, that's shifting, from the position in which the United States government is. I think data collection is important. That data collection should go beyond the center. I think it should go to the peripheries. We need to understand how the Oromo peasant, the Somali pastoralist, the Tigray farmer is feeling about the current Ethiopian government, and then we can build a policy on that. But if we just do what the IMF does, which is to collect data from the Ethiopian Statistical Office, we will never understand what the people want from the state. And I think that's where we have failed. We collected data from narrow confines of the elite and the center. Thank you. If I add, I think the US has limitations. Of course, I agree, but it has two factors that neither the Soviet nor the Chinese have. Number one, US help and aid in terms of famine relief and development dollars is unparalleled, unmatched. And Ethiopians and the Horn of Africa in general will always be thankful to that. And that's a huge leverage. How we use is a different thing, but that's one thing that no one has. The second factor that the US has that Russia, China don't have is also the diaspora, which are part of the American fabric. And that's a huge source in terms of the right information, and also, having both, countries, I think we need to recognize that whatever Russia does is a destruction towards the Ethiopian state and the Horn. Whatever America can do is more positive in terms of the aid. We just need to know how we can capitalize. Having said that, I think Ethiopia is experiencing many wars. The Tigray war is the biggest, the Oromo war is now the largest. But there are many wars also. The Afar Somali war is another one, the Afar Tigray. So I think we need to expand the scope, sustain and support the Tigray and Ethiopian federal government talks that started, try to open another quick but very needed channel between the Oromo groups, inclusive Oromo groups and the federal government. If they cannot be part of the one that's supposed to start in Kenya, start a parallel one. Later on, we can join all that. I would say is, I think the U.S. State Department and the embassy needs to show a sort of even-handed, not only to stay in Addis and talk to those elites, but go to Jigjiga, to Adama, to Walega, to other areas, so that they can also have conversations with people who are outside the center and get the real ideas. And thank you very much.